The night sky tore open, with orange flames devouring the wooden rooftops. Emily Carter cried out, as smoke clawed into her lungs, choking her. She stumbled through the chaos, her heart pounding like a drum of despair. Children screamed, mothers called, and walls cracked with fury. "Help me!" Emily shouted, her voice swallowed by the roar of fire. A beam fell, showering sparks across her torn dress, but she pushed forward, desperate to survive. The fire wasn't only wood and smoke. It was her past rising from the shadows. Every flame whispered of pain she couldn't escape, but still she ran, her bare feet striking the dirt. Neighbors shoved past her, fear twisting their faces into masks of terror. She looked back once, her home collapsing, and whispered, "I have nothing left." But as tears streaked her soot-covered cheeks, something within her hardened. This was not her end. This was her beginning, though the night screamed otherwise. Morning came, but the ashes still smoldered where Emily's home once stood. She sat alone on the cold ground, clutching her knees, staring into the wreckage. Her body trembled, her throat raw from smoke. "Why am I still here?" she whispered. The silence around her was deafening, broken only by the crack of collapsing wood. Memories flashed like ghosts, the laughter of her mother, the warmth of a fire before it betrayed her. She wanted to scream, but no sound came. Emily wiped her face with soot-covered hands, her chest aching. Hunger gnawed at her, but her grief weighed heavier. She stood finally, wobbling on weak legs. "I have to move," she told herself, "or I will die here too." Each step forward was heavy, but the ashes behind her were heavier still, pressing her to keep walking, no matter how empty she felt inside. Emily wandered through the village ruins, her eyes scanning the charred remains of lives gone. The air reeked of smoke and despair. She reached down, lifting a broken toy from the dirt, her lips trembling. "They're gone," she whispered. Each home was a grave, each shadow a memory too painful to hold. Strangers passed her, eyes hollow, searching for something that wasn't there anymore. One man muttered, "Nothing left for any of us." Emily clutched the toy tighter, her chest heavy. Her hair hung loose, tangled with ash. She dropped the toy and pressed her palm against her chest, as if to hold her heart inside. "I must be stronger," she said, though her voice cracked like fragile glass. She staggered forward into a world that had erased everything she loved, unsure if strength meant surviving or simply refusing to fall. In the distance, a tall figure appeared among the wreckage, Richard Hale, his sharp suit untouched by ash. His cold eyes scanned the survivors as if they were insects crawling from the dirt. Emily froze, watching him stride forward, boots clean against the charred ground. He spoke to a villager with disdain. This was inevitable. His tone was dismissive, his gaze detached. Emily clenched her fists. Anger burned hotter than the fire had. She whispered, "He doesn't care about any of us." Richard's words sliced through the air. "Rebuild or perish. That is all." Then he turned, his coat swaying like a curtain over secrets. Emily's jaw tightened. The man before her wasn't just rich. He was power, untouchable, and she knew in her bones he would stand in her way again and again. That night, Emily sat under a shattered tree, the stars veiled by smoke. Her arms wrapped around her knees, her eyes hollow but steady. "I can't let this end me," she whispered into the night. Pain coursed through her, yet a quiet fire sparked inside. The memory of Richard's cold eyes haunted her, but she would not be broken. The world wanted her gone, erased like ash, but she refused to fade. Emily pressed her forehead against her knees, trembling, but in that tremble was resolve. "I will endure," she promised herself. Her voice shook, but it was there, small yet unyielding. Above, the night whispered nothing back, but the silence itself felt like a witness to her vow. In the ruins of everything, she planted a seed of survival, knowing storms would come, but this seed would not die. Emily walked beyond the ashes into the open fields, her dress torn, her body weak, but her eyes lifted to the horizon. Dreams that once felt foolish flickered in her mind like faint lanterns. She whispered, I wanted more than this life, more than hunger and fire. Her fingers traced the scar on her arm, a reminder of pain she could not outrun. For years, she had imagined escape, a place where her name wasn't bound to suffering. She closed her eyes and saw herself painting in sunlight, laughter free of fear, her own voice strong and unbroken. But reality pressed back with the weight of despair. How can I dream, she murmured, when the world only takes? The wind swept across the field, carrying both ash and hope. She exhaled slowly, torn between collapse and the small flame that insisted she keep dreaming, even in ruin. Marcus Gray appeared as Emily stumbled near the edge of the ruins. He was a broad-shouldered man with kind eyes hardened by years of struggle. He placed a hand on her shoulder and said, You're stronger than you think. Emily met his gaze, her lips trembling. I don't feel strong. Marcus crouched beside her, his voice calm. Strength isn't always fire, sometimes it's surviving the ashes. His words settled into her heart like embers refusing to die. For the first time since the fire, Emily allowed herself to lean against another's soul. His presence was solid, steady, like stone against her storm. Why are you helping me? She whispered. Marcus's jaw tightened, memories flickering in his eyes. Because once no one helped me. Emily's chest ached, but beneath it, something softened. In his voice she heard belief, and it felt like the first step toward healing. The days blurred into labor and survival. Emily carried buckets of water from the well, her arms trembling under the weight, her dress soaked with sweat. Children cried nearby, hungry, their voices hollow like empty bowls. She knelt beside them, handing what little bread she had, her stomach clenching in silence. A villager muttered, This is no life for anyone. Emily forced a smile, though her insides cracked. Marcus watched from a distance, pride in his eyes, but also sorrow. She whispered to herself, If I keep moving, maybe I'll remember who I am. Her hands blistered, her body bent, but she endured. Each drop of sweat was proof she hadn't given up, even when the world begged her to fall. The sun sank red against the horizon, and Emily stood alone in shadow, whispering, Tomorrow must be different. One evening, as Emily sat beside the well, Daniel Ross approached. He was younger, lighter in spirit, his smile carrying warmth like summer. You look like you've wrestled the whole world, he teased, sitting beside her. Emily raised an eyebrow, exhaustion shadowing her features. And lost. Daniel laughed softly, shaking his head. Losing isn't the same as giving up. His voice was gentle, but persistent. He handed her a small piece of fruit. Take it. You look like you need it more than me. Emily hesitated, then accepted, tasting sweetness she hadn't felt in weeks. For a moment, the weight lifted. She glanced at him, surprised by the ease he brought. Why are you so kind? She asked. Daniel's smile faded just a little. Because someone once was kind to me when I didn't deserve it. Their eyes met, and something unspoken formed between them. Emily began to find fragile comfort in Daniel's company, yet shadows lurked where she least expected. Sophie Miller, her longtime friend, appeared smiling brightly, her eyes sharp beneath the mask. Emily, I'm here for you, Sophie said, wrapping her arms around her. Emily clung to the embrace, relief flooding her chest. But deep inside, Sophie's thoughts swirled dark with envy. She glanced at Daniel, her smile stiffening, her grip tightening. Emily whispered, I don't know what I'd do without you. Sophie's lips curved sweetly, though her eyes burned. You'll never have to find out. In that moment, Emily's trust bloomed, unaware that Sophie's loyalty was fragile as smoke. The betrayal had not yet arrived, but its shadow crept silently closer, hidden in the warmth of friendship that Emily believed was unbreakable. Richard Hale returned to the ruined village weeks later, his polished boots sinking into the dirt without care. Survivors bent their heads as he passed, their silence heavy. Emily watched from the shadows, fists clenched. He owns everything, she thought bitterly, even our fear. Richard surveyed the wreckage, his voice cold, rebuild or be forgotten. His gaze landed briefly on Emily, lingering with a smirk that pierced like a knife. Her stomach twisted, rage and dread fighting inside her. He walked away, coat swaying, leaving his words behind like chains. Emily whispered, "I will not bow." Yet her voice shook. She knew his power could crush her with ease, but inside her chest, a quiet flame burned. Richard's cruelty only fed it. She promised herself one day she would stand where he stood, and he would see her not as prey, but as defiance. That night, Marcus Gray found Emily sitting alone near the broken well, her hands scraped from work. He crouched, studying her face with quiet concern. "You let him get in your head," he said. Emily looked down, her voice brittle. "He holds everything. I have nothing." Marcus shook his head, eyes firm. "You have yourself. That's more than he'll ever own." Emily's lips trembled as tears blurred her sight. "I'm afraid." Marcus gripped her hand, his tone steady. "Fear is proof you're alive. Use it. Don't let it use you." His words felt like stones grounding her. She inhaled shakily, pressing his strength into her chest. The night was heavy, but with Marcus beside her, Emily felt a moment of stillness. A pause where survival didn't seem impossible. "I'll try," she whispered, and for the first time she believed it. Sophie Miller arrived the next morning, her auburn hair shining despite the soot-stained air. She smiled brightly, her arms open wide. "Emily, I've missed you." Emily's heart lifted at the sight, her loneliness breaking. They embraced, warmth seeping into Emily's bones. "I thought I lost everyone," she whispered. Sophie stroked her back, her voice smooth. "You'll never lose me." Yet behind her eyes envy flickered faintly, unseen by Emily's trust. Daniel Ross joined them, smiling lightly, though his gaze lingered on Sophie with unease. Emily, unaware of the tension, laughed for the first time in weeks. "I need you both," she said, hope returning to her face. Sophie squeezed her hand tightly, her voice sweet. "And you'll always have us." The words were honey, but the sting of betrayal was already hidden within. Work grew harder as food grew scarce. Emily carried heavy loads, her body aching, her face pale from hunger. Her hands bled as she stacked broken wood, sweat dripping into open wounds. Villagers murmured, some collapsing from exhaustion. She whispered, "I can't stop." Daniel handed her a cup of water, his voice urging, "Rest, at least for a moment." She shook her head, gulping down the drink but standing again quickly. Marcus watched with furrowed brows, whispering, "She'll break herself." Still, Emily pushed on, her shoulders trembling, determination carved into her frame. "If I keep moving," she told herself, "I won't feel the emptiness." Poverty pressed like chains, dragging everyone down, but she fought with every fragile ounce of strength. She was frail, but she refused to fall. Then came the spark that changed everything. Late one night, flames broke again, but not from destruction. It was a torch carried by a stranger, calling for help. "Opportunity waits beyond the river," he shouted. Emily froze, her heart racing. Could this be escape? Marcus frowned, his voice low. "Not every door leads to freedom." Daniel's eyes brightened. "But some do." Emily clenched her fists, staring at the stranger's torch cutting through the night. "This could be my chance," she whispered, trembling with fear and hope tangled together. Sophie stood beside her, smiling faintly, her eyes calculating. Emily stepped forward, the firelight reflecting in her eyes. The choice loomed heavy. The flames that once destroyed her now offered a spark of change. She didn't yet know it, but her journey had truly begun. Sophie led Emily to a quiet storehouse at dusk, her smile bright and steady. Emily felt relief soften her guard. Sophie Miller said, "I found someone who can help." The door opened, and Richard stepped from the shadow. Richard Hale said, "Help has a price." Emily's breath caught as men blocked the exit. She stared at Sophie, her chest tightening. Emily Carter said, "You brought him to me." Sophie's voice trembled but held. Sophie Miller said, "I needed security. He promised protection." Richard's gaze sliced clean. Richard Hale said, "You are leverage, nothing more." Emily felt the world tilt. The torchlight flickered like judgment on her skin. She swallowed the rising ache and stood straighter. Emily Carter said, "I will not be owned." Sophie's eyes filled with fear and envy. The deal was done. The trust was broken. The night sealed it like ink. Emily fled, stumbling into the night until the river found her. She collapsed at the bank, gulping air like water. Daniel rushed from the reeds and dropped beside her. Daniel Ross said, "I'm here. Breathe with me." She matched his rhythm, hands shaking. Emily Carter said, "She sold me." Daniel's jaw set, and sorrow cooled his warmth. Daniel Ross said, "Then let me buy you time." He wrapped his jacket around her shoulders. The river moved like a steady voice in the dark. Marcus arrived, eyes burning. Marcus Gray said, "You're safe for now." Emily stared at the current and felt its pull. The pain loosened as fear drained through her fingers. She wiped her face and steadied her breath. Emily Carter said, "I won't freeze here." The night did not answer, but it did not crush her. At dawn, Emily found the old teacher near the chapel ruins. Eleanor's hands were weathered like maps. Eleanor Price said, "Sit. Let the ground hold you." Emily obeyed, breath shallow, but even. Eleanor studied her quietly, and then spoke. Eleanor Price said, "Pain repeats until you rewrite it." Emily looked away, shame heavy as stone. Emily Carter said, "I trusted the wrong heart." Eleanor nodded with a small, sad smile. Eleanor Price said, "Trust the one you build inside." She told a brief story of a girl who planted corn in burned soil and fed a village. Emily felt the parable settle like seed. She pressed her palm to her chest and listened. The wind passed through the broken arch and carried ash aside. Emily Carter said, "Teach me to endure without hardening." Eleanor opened a worn ledger and a small locket, both saved from the fire. She placed them in Emily's hands with care. Eleanor Price said, "Your mother kept records for men with clean cuffs." Emily traced a name that hurt to read. What? Richard Hale. Numbers told a quiet war of land and debt. Emily Carter said, "He owned our roof before it burned." Eleanor's gaze held steady. Eleanor Price said, "She tried to expose him. The flames came after." The locket clicked open to a tiny sketch and a promise. Emily's pulse beat hard in her throat. She tasted metal and memory. Marcus stepped closer, reading the page, his face set. Marcus Gray said, "This is proof of a reason." Emily closed the ledger and felt a hinge turn inside. By evening, the village felt different, as if the earth had shifted under the ashes. Emily stood in the square with the ledger hidden under her dress. Daniel hovered at her side, silent but certain. Marcus gripped a tool like a pledge. Sophie watched from a doorway, eyes thin with worry. Emily Carter said, "We cross the river, then we fight smart." Daniel Ross said, "I'll get you a boat." Marcus Gray said, "I'll draw them off your trail." Sophie stepped forward and faltered. Sophie Miller said, "I can fix this." Emily held her gaze and felt the bruise of trust. She chose not to answer. The night wind rose and scattered soot like old lies. The path was set, even if the map was not. Emily sat by the riverbank, clutching the ledger. The wind flipped its pages, revealing her mother's handwriting and Richard Hale's seal. Her breath caught as truth struck hard. Emily Carter said, "He wasn't just my oppressor. He was the shadow behind my mother's death." The ledger bared debts, signatures, lies, and betrayal woven into her past. Her chest tightened as though the water itself pressed against her lungs. Marcus watched, eyes heavy with sorrow. Marcus Gray said, "This is the root of your chains." Daniel stood near, fists clenched. Daniel Ross said, "Then we cut them." Emily closed the book slowly, her hand trembling yet firm. Emily Carter said, "He burned my home to erase her truth, but he left me." The night held its breath as her resolve sharpened into steel. Richard Hale returned to the square the next day, flanked by guards. His coat trailed like command itself. He scanned faces, indifferent to fear. Richard Hale said, "You exist because I allow it." Emily stepped forward, the ledger hidden close. Her knees quivered, but she raised her chin. Emily Carter said, "One day your power will choke you." His smirk curled like smoke. Richard Hale said, "And who will strangle me? You?" Villagers bowed their heads lower, silence choking the air. Emily's heart pounded, but her fire grew. Each word was a promise to herself. Richard's voice dripped with disdain as he turned away. Emily's fists clenched, the ledger pressed tight. His dominance cut her small, but her silence burned hotter than his words. Emily turned to Sophie, desperate for comfort, but Sophie's mask cracked. Sophie Miller said, "You don't see it, do you? You'll ruin everything chasing him." Emily froze, her chest aching. Emily Carter said, "You were my sister in spirit." Sophie's eyes burned, her voice sharp. Sophie Miller said, "And I'll survive even if you fall." Daniel stepped between them, protective. Daniel Ross said, "She trusted you." Sophie's smile twisted, sharp and thin. Sophie Miller said, "Trust makes fools of us all." Emily's tears blurred her sight, the wound deeper than fire. Her soul shook, but inside, defiance held steady. She whispered, "You will not define me." Betrayal stung, but it did not kill. Sophie's silence lingered heavy, the echo of a bond shattered beyond repair. Marcus found Emily alone, her hands trembling as she clutched the ledger. He knelt, voice low. Marcus Gray said, "I can distract him. You'll run." Emily's eyes widened. Emily Carter said, "You'll be killed." He shook his head, steady as stone. Marcus Gray said, "Better me than you. You are the chance she died for." Emily's throat ached, her body torn between protest and understanding. He pressed her shoulder with steady strength. Marcus Gray said, "Promise me you'll keep walking." Her tears fell onto his worn jacket. Emily Carter said, "I promise." He turned toward the square, carrying a torch not of flame, but of sacrifice. She watched as the man who taught her to endure walked into danger, and she felt both broken and remade. Marcus's distraction drew Richard's gaze, but Emily slipped into the crowd unseen. She pressed the ledger close to her chest, her breath ragged but fierce. The betrayal, the lies, the loss, they carved her, but they did not hollow her. She whispered, "This is not my cage, this is my fire." Daniel caught her arm as she passed, eyes sharp with resolve. Daniel Ross said, "I'll be with you." Emily nodded once, a silent pact forged in survival. Behind them, Sophie lingered, her eyes unreadable, torn between envy and regret. Emily stepped forward. Every footfall a defiance, every breath a refusal to break. Richard loomed still, but his power no longer chained her spirit. The war was no longer his, it was hers to claim. The night air was heavy, thick with the smell of smoke and damp earth, as Emily stepped into the square where Richard waited. Her heart pounded, each beat echoing louder than the crowd that had gathered in silence. Richard Hale said, "You look like your mother standing here, defiant and doomed." The words struck like a blade, but Emily stood taller, clutching the ledger hidden against her chest. She whispered, "Not doomed, not like her." The villagers turned their eyes, hope faint but flickering. Daniel moved closer, ready to shield her, but Emily raised a hand, steady. Emily Carter said, "This is between him and me." Marcus's absence pressed against her heart, his sacrifice burning like an ember that would never die. Richard circled, like a predator with all the time in the world. Emily's breath shook, but her voice did not. Emily Carter said, "You burned my home, but not my fire." Richard stepped closer, his eyes sharp with cruelty, his voice low enough to slice. Richard Hale said, "Power is mine because no one dares seize it." Emily forced herself not to step back. She lifted the ledger high for all to see. Emily Carter said, "My mother dared, and I will finish what she began." Gasps spread like wildfire across the square. Richard's jaw tightened, but his smirk lingered. He raised his hand, signaling his guards. Daniel leapt forward, shouting, "She is not alone!" The guards advanced, but villagers began to stir, shifting closer to Emily, their fear bending toward defiance. Richard sneered, "They follow fear. They always will." Emily's voice rang, trembling yet unbroken. Emily Carter said, "Not tonight." Her mother's handwriting stared back at her from the pages, her legacy alive in ink and fire. Sophie pushed through the crowd, her eyes wet with conflict. Sophie Miller said, "Stop this, Emily. Give it to him and you'll live." Emily's throat tightened as she stared at the friend who had betrayed her. Emily Carter said, "You already chose your side." Sophie shook, her hands trembling. Sophie Miller said, "I never wanted to hurt you. I wanted to survive." Daniel's voice cut in sharp with fury. Daniel Ross said, "You sold her for scraps." Sophie flinched, then stepped forward anyway. Sophie Miller said, "Let me stand now." Emily's heart wavered, the wound raw, but she met Sophie's gaze. Emily Carter said, "If you stand, stand true." For a moment, Sophie's mask broke and regret bled through. Whether her redemption was real, Emily could not know, but she turned back to Richard, refusing to let doubt weaken her. Chaos erupted as Richard barked orders. His guards surged forward, villagers scattering. Emily clutched the ledger, nearly knocked down, until Daniel pulled her upright. His voice was fierce. Daniel Ross said, "Run." She shook her head. Emily Carter said, "No more running." Richard's coat swirled as he marched toward her. Richard Hale said, "You want war, girl? Then bleed for it." He shoved Daniel aside, striking him hard. Emily cried out, her chest breaking at the sight, but she held her ground. Richard towered over her, his hand reaching for the ledger. Emily whispered, "You'll never erase her again." She tore free, raising the book higher. The crowd's fear cracked, some stepping forward. The world roared in fire, betrayal, sacrifice, and courage colliding. Emily felt Marcus in her chest, urging her to stand when standing seemed impossible. The square froze in one breathless moment. Emily, battered but unyielding, stepped closer to Richard. Emily Carter said, "You cannot own truth." She slammed the ledger into his chest, forcing him back. Richard stumbled, the crowd gasping. The guards hesitated as whispers surged like a tide. "She is her mother's daughter." Richard roared, but his voice cracked. He reached for Emily again, but she held her ground. Emily Carter said, "This ends tonight." Daniel rose painfully, standing beside her, his arms steady though bleeding. Sophie took one step, her eyes wet, finally silent but present. The villagers closed in, the tide turning at last. Richard's sneer faltered. For the first time, fear touched his gaze. Emily's voice broke the night, strong, trembling, alive. Emily Carter said, "You will not break me. Not now, not ever." Dawn broke soft and gray, ash drifting like feathers through the air. Emily stood at the river's edge, the ledger now closed, its truth carried in every survivor's voice. She exhaled, her body aching, her spirit raw but intact. Daniel limped to her side, his hand resting lightly on her arm. Daniel Ross said, "We made it through." She looked at him, her lips trembling. Emily Carter said, "We lost too much." His reply was soft, but steady. Daniel Ross said, "And still you stand." Behind them, villagers moved with quiet strength, rebuilding with hands blistered, but hearts awake. Richard's absence echoed, his shadow broken. Emily closed her eyes and whispered into the wind, "Mother, I kept it." The river caught her words, carrying them forward. For the first time, the world felt wide enough for her hope. Later, Emily returned to the chapel ruins where Eleanor waited. The older woman's gaze was calm, knowing. Eleanor Price said, "You carry both wound and weapon now." Emily nodded, placing the ledger on the stone altar. Emily Carter said, "This is more than mine. It's ours." Eleanor's hands brushed the worn cover with reverence. Eleanor Price said, "Your mother would be proud." Emily felt tears sting but refused to let them break her voice. Emily Carter said, "She gave me more than blood. She gave me a fight." Eleanor smiled, a mixture of pride and sorrow. Eleanor Price said, "And you gave it back to us." The chapel light slanted through broken stone, soft and golden. Emily whispered, "Then it was not wasted." For the first time, peace touched her heart, even in grief. Daniel found Emily later in the fields, her hands running over tall grass swaying in the breeze. He laughed gently. Daniel Ross said, "You look free." Emily's lips curled into a faint smile. Emily Carter said, "Maybe I am." His eyes softened, and for a moment silence bound them closer than words. He said quietly, "You don't have to carry it all alone." She looked at him, her chest tightening with both fear and comfort. Emily Carter said, "I've carried shadows for so long, I'm learning to carry light." Daniel smiled, leaning on his injured side, still refusing to break. Daniel Ross said, "Then I'll carry what's left beside you." The sun dipped lower, painting the sky in fire and gold. Emily breathed deep, tasting the promise of something beyond survival, something like life. That night, Emily sat with Sophie beneath the broken tree. Sophie's eyes were swollen, voice faint. Sophie Miller said, "I can't undo it." Emily's chest ached, her throat tight, but she nodded. Emily Carter said, "You can't, but you can choose differently now." Sophie swallowed hard, tears falling. Sophie Miller said, "You should hate me." Emily's eyes softened with weary truth. Emily Carter said, "I hate what you did, not who you are." Sophie sobbed quietly, leaning against the tree. For once, no masks, no envy, only a girl broken by her choices. Emily turned to the stars faint above. Emily Carter said, "We all burned, but we can rise." Sophie's silence lingered, but she stayed. In that small quiet forgiveness grew, not complete, but possible. At dawn's first light, Emily walked alone to the highest hill. The village spread behind her, rising from ash, voices of life drifting faintly on the wind. She stopped at the crest, her silhouette framed against the horizon. She whispered, "This was my final chance, and I took it." The wind lifted her hair, carrying her words forward. She thought her mother, of Marcus, of the fire that nearly consumed her. Their voices echoed in her memory, not as chains, but as fuel. Emily Carter said, "I will not be erased." She breathed deeply, her body weary, but her soul unbroken. The sun rose, bleeding gold across the sky, touching her face. For the first time, the girl who once had nothing felt the vast weight of everything, and she bore it not with fear, but with fierce, defiant hope.